Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Flaig. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Film Studies at the University of St. Andrews, and I'm the author of the recent book, Weimar Slapstick and Hollywood Comedy Transformed.
Hi, and I'm Dr. Paddy Adamson. I'm an associate lecturer in the Department of Film Studies at the University of St. Andrews, and similarly, I have a recent book just come out, which is Projecting America, the Epic Western and National Myth-Making in 1920s Hollywood.
It's going to be a lot of fun. We'll have a combination of clips with live musical accompaniment from a range of different kinds of films. There'll be sort of illustrated presentations and talks using lots of different kinds of interesting images from our respective research. And there'll be time for conversation both between Paddy and myself, and also kind of Q&A for the audience. I'll be talking about some of the ideas and images from my book, which explores the kind of extraordinary popularity and presence of American slapstick and cartoon comedy in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. But we'll be more generally just celebrating the kind of wonderful different kinds of figures, films, stars of silent cinema more generally. And I'll be talking a lot about comedy especially, and bringing in people like Ernst Lubitsch, Felix the Cat, and many others.
Yeah, and I will be talking about my book, Projecting America, and specifically looking in at how the Western came to be such a ubiquitous thing during the 1920s, not just when we think about kind of cowboy films, but also kind of prestige productions, the very almost seen as very much the finest thing that Hollywood was putting out during that period. It's a period in the history of the genre that tends to be seen almost as I would say, a prehistory to the more established classical Western, and its heyday in the 1930s, the 1940s. I was immediately just so taken with it. I must have been 11, maybe 12, and I think the logic of these films, the kind of maybe the kind of sort of the briskness of some of the comedy in them was something that really appealed to me as a young child, and that became I would say, the starting point of my interest in silent film. And now I'm lucky enough to do it as to study it for work, and that very much came about from the fact that when I moved out of home, when I first set off to university, I got quite into collecting film on 8mm and 9.5mm film formats, using kind of my own projector to watch films that maybe didn't otherwise circulate, because yes, there were a good range of films available on DVD, I suppose VHS to some degree back in those days as well, but there were so many films that just were not available to access, and that led to me seeking them out on kind of earlier film formats that were no longer, I suppose, broadly in use. And this, in fact, is what led me to my topic, the topic of my research, my work on the epic Western. I came across a film being sold very cheaply on eBay for £15, a feature film, a feature silent Western. I didn't really care what it was at that point. £15 for a feature film was a great deal. I sat down one day, I watched it on my living room wall as maybe an 18, 19-year-old, and I was really taken with the fact that here was a film that was clearly an incredibly big budget film, really lavish, incredible kind of scale to the thing that, yes, maybe this was reduced somewhat by seeing it just projected on my living room wall, but it prompted me to start looking into it and discover that this film that I was looking at was The Covered Wagon from 1923, that this was a film that in its heyday was regarded as one of the greatest American films of all time, certainly the most important Western ever made, and yet it had dropped completely out of conversation. People just were not really talking about it anymore. So for me, kind of that exposure through both my childhood, through my kind of interest in collecting film on a actual film itself, that led me to my topic, and also led me to kind of be in a position where I could look to tell a story about silent film that otherwise just wasn't being told.
They showed sort of what are called repertory films, older films, and they showed Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush. And it was a kind of magical experience and had a real impact on me. And eventually just became interested in film much, more generally, and became a great cinephile, and then became a student of film, and eventually started writing about Chaplin in a very different context, which was the context that eventually has sort of taken shape as my book, which is his kind of extraordinary sort of German career, both the times he visited Germany, but also all of his German fans, and then most notoriously his kind of status as a kind of enemy of Adolf Hitler, who he then famously satirized in The Great Dictator. I think people have to understand that with silent film, it's a kind of whole other kind of country. It's a vast landscape. It covers almost 40 years of film history, and it touches numerous kinds of genres, numerous cultures and traditions, and then it emerges in the 1890s out of all sorts of different kinds of theatrical, literary, scientific, fairground contexts, and it kind of develops out of this kind of complex stew of different kinds of cultural factors, and goes through all these different kinds of evolutions and transitions in the early part of the 20th century, around 1900. But then by the late 19-teens and 1920s, which is really the period that Paddy and I are both writing about in different ways, we reach this period of real kind of extraordinary creativity and achievement that's happening in a lot of different ways. Now, in my own context, which is in Germany, most people, when they think about silent film and they think about Germany, think about something like Expressionism, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or they'll think about a film like Metropolis. And these are amazing, great achievements. But what I was interested in is not so much all these famous German films that were made, but I was interested in how German film was actually very much in dialogue with other kinds of cultures and traditions, including the United States, and especially American slapstick comedians like Charlie Chaplin. And so that's kind of where my research kind of focuses on this period in silent cinema.
I think one of the things I'm particularly excited to show is a short clip from a Will Rogers film from 1924, Two Wagons Both Covered. Rogers is a very interesting figure because he was just about the most famous man in the United States at a certain point in the 1920s, 30s. He's also born in the Cherokee Nation, so he has a very unusual perspective on kind of the Western more generally, as he's on one hand someone who has this history of working as a cowboy and in Wild West shows, but he's also someone who's somewhat seemed to be on the margins of that too. But at the same time, he's this incredibly, I think, ubiquitous public figure during that point in the 1920s, the 1930s, and his kind of way of, let's say, upending to some degree the conventional myths of American Westerns and the kind of the histories that are written around those makes for I think, quite a kind of novel contribution to our understanding of both the Western and kind of American history making.
Highlight for me will be there's a clip of a foxtrot epidemic from an Ernst Lubitsch film called The Oyster Princess, in which an entire sort of wedding party is consumed by the foxtrot that kind of takes over everybody, and everybody's dancing and making music. It should be a really kind of fun moment, and we'll see what our musical accompanist comes up with for this on his keyboard.